What was the beginning of your history with video games in general?
The first game I remember playing was Super Mario Brothers 1 when I was in kindergarten, going over to a friend's house. And it's a bit fuzzy now, but there was just, when I was growing up, the whole schoolyard and everything, there was just this buzz around Nintendo, and everyone wanted one, everyone wanted to play it. It was the coolest toy. Do
you consider yourself more a fan of those older, like NES, Super NES style games than modern games, or did your tastes mature at the same time?
I like both. And to me, they're kind of apples and oranges, although a lot of the time these days I don't necessarily play only retro games, but I often veer towards games like Spelunky that are retro styled because I love just picking up and playing a game. And I sadly still have games years old that are still shrink wrapped because they're 40-hour experiences, and I'm just like, oh, I don't have 40 hours right now. I'll play them later, and I never do. So that's where these old retro style games that you can just jump into come into play.
You don't have 40 hours, but you have like a few minutes, or you have to do like a level, or to do to play a little bit, right?
Exactly.
Do you think, what is your insight into the popularity of these retro style games? Because obviously, I mean, okay, for anyone who doesn't know, right, you are essentially the sole developer of Retro City Rampage, right? So I imagine that's why I'm inferring that you're a fan of retro games, right?
Yeah.
Do you have any insight into, because now there's like, you mentioned Spelunky, there's Shovel Knight, there's Towerfall, there's all these like pixel art kind of games. What do you think it is that's causing this resurgence and interest in those?
It's really funny, and I can't quite say. I mean, there are a bunch of factors, but I had started working on this game a long, long time ago. So I was tinkering with the idea of an 8-bit open world game and working on it part-time while working at other game companies, and then gradually snowballing it. And eventually I started my own company, spent 3 years on it, and released it. But in that time period, before Mega Man 9 came out, before this retro thing happened, it's funny, no one believed in it. No one trying to pitch it to people, biz dev people or whatnot, and just gauging interest, thinking, oh, they thought I was crazy, the whole idea of quitting my job to do this retro game. And then finally quitting my job to start my own company was a risk that I wanted to do for years, and I just couldn't take the plunge. I was too afraid. And during those years, no one believed in it. Everyone was like, that's crazy, who's gonna buy it? And then Mega Man 9 came out, and that really freaked me out because not only was it a hit, I thought, oh no, they did the retro thing.
Right.
They've stolen the thunder. Now I can't do the retro thing. Like, I was worried like that they did it. And now, of course, since RCR came out, more and more and more retro style games are coming out and still being successful. So it's like, that was just the beginning. But at the time, I was worried that Mega Man 9 had stolen my thunder. Yeah.
Right. Okay, so let's actually get into now the history of your time with Retro City Rampage, because you've actually been working in the games industry for a long time, right? You went to BCIT when you were 14, right? So how did that actually happen? This way of going into BCIT while you were still in high school?
Well, I had been teaching myself, just grabbing books anywhere I could find to learn how to program. I think I started when I tinkered around with things, and there was a program called Click and Play, which was like Game Maker, and I was playing with that, I think in around 96 or something. And then a year or two after that, I started programming and teaching myself C++ and C. But I was too impatient, and that was the thing. I didn't want to wait until I was done high school to get into it, and so I started looking at different schools, and I looked at a few, and then I ended up going to BCIT on Wednesday nights and Saturday mornings, and I think Friday nights, and that was really cool, and I learned a lot, and I think that everyone should. I think school is a better way to get started, but again, I was just too impatient, and so I just kept teaching myself, and eventually it was just not really matching up with school, and it was easier to just go at the pace I was going. So
it's funny, right? Because you mentioned that it's important to get education, because so many people, when they begin getting into game development, they're self-taught. Many people in Vancouver are self-taught. It's funny because you're talking about like C++ and stuff. Do you think that if you were making Retro City Rampage today, or if you were starting a game development today, that you would have even like learned C++, or would you have just gone straight to Unity? Like, do you know what I mean?
That's a really valid question, and I'm in a fortunate spot now where I spent so many years building a C++ engine that now I have it. If I were at square one right now, it would probably be pretty crazy to create my own engine. And when I had started this game, it wasn't my day job, and so it wasn't really a big deal if I'm gonna. It was great because the whole idea of building your own engine, you learn everything. So it's like if you haven't done something before that the engine needs, you do it and you learn how to do it, and that's really valuable. But once you, it's your job, and you've got to release a game, and there's competition, you know, breathing down your necks, and just all these things. You can't be wasting time for years and years reinventing the wheel, and that's when the issue comes where it's just like, no, it's crazy spending 5 years on an engine or whatever. That's just not viable.
So let's get into Retro City Rampage itself now, right? Because you mentioned that you quit your job. Was that your job at Backbone?
Propaganda was the last studio I worked at, yeah.
Okay. That's interesting. That's a whole other topic. Propaganda. There's a whole book waiting to be said in the history of propaganda games. But here's the point. Retro City Rampage started as a different game, right? What was it originally?
Originally, before I did Retro City Rampage, I was working on a Grand Theft Auto game that was actually running on the NES. So I was building it in machine code, assembly language, and it ran on an old NES hard system, which I had modified so that it could play my own games.
So at what point did it go from this hobby project, making a game for the NES, to like, no, this is now... You know, not that, I mean, I guess in theory it was a commercial project always, but now it's like, this is my business now. I'm going to make this game and sell it.
So yeah, when I was doing the NES game, it was just for fun. It wasn't going to be a commercial product. And then I got busy working at Backbone, Digital Eclipse at the time, and I was just working, sometimes crunch time, so your whole day is at the office and then you're just going home to sleep. And when my time became more precious there, I was just realizing, okay, well, this is how much work I need to do to finish the game. This is how much time I have right now. I need to figure out how to make best use of my time. And so certain things evolved in thinking, number one, releasing it on an old NES, it takes way longer to develop than developing it in retro style on a new system. So that's a time saver to switch from that. Developing it on an actual NES, you're not going to reach very many people, and if you're spending years on a game, you want a lot of people to play it, and so that was another thing. And then the other thing is, like, if I'm doing a Grand Theft Auto style game, it's going to be an uphill battle to try and get a license, so I should just make my own game. And so one thing led to another, and eventually I was just like, I'm going to do a retro styled game that's my own IP instead, and then it just went from there. But the whole really driving force originally was, I want to see what it would be like to play an open world game as if it were an actual NES game, if it were released in the 80s. But then over time it evolved more and more, and I started to think, well, you know, this 8-bit style game, why don't I add some references and nods to the era? And I was less excited about the whole prospect of what would it have been like in the 80s, and more like, I just want to make a fun game. And so because I was working on it mostly myself, and it took so many years, it kept evolving and evolving, and so it eventually became what it was.
How do you describe Retro City Rampage to people that aren't familiar with it? Like, do you say it's like retro GTA, or do you have like your own elevator pitch?
Yeah, the elevator pitch is kind of Super Mario meets Grand Theft Auto, even though it's not a Super Mario game or, you know, Grand Theft Auto exactly, but I think that kind of, it sets the tone more than describes the game itself.
Right. And so, I mean, there's a lot to talk about with Retro City Rampage, but I think the thing that I'm most interested in talking about is how unbelievably successful it was, right? So what was it like after you've actually released the game, because you had different kind of console deals. How did you actually deal with, like, like, a ton of people are buying this? Like, how do you deal with that? Like,
so it was actually interesting because it had so much buzz leading up to the launch and all these awards and coverage, and it was at all these events. And so you go through periods where, like, I hope this is successful. I'm going to do my best, and then this is totally going to be successful. And you see stories like Super Meat Boy and Braid and everything, and so you think that it's going to be an overnight success. And so my hopes were actually too high when it launched. And when it first launched, it came out the same day as the two biggest games of the year, and it wasn't the best launch. And so it was actually very stressful. And so for the first few months, I was actually disappointed and stressed, and I had worked so hard for so many years. And then it picked up, and it ended up selling more in the next year and more units in the next year on top of that, and being a huge, huge success. But when you look at the first few months, which is, in many cases, it's actually rare. Most games, it's like your first week tells you how it's going to do, and that wasn't the case in this. And so I was very lucky, but it was a rocky few first months.
Well, see, here's kind of what I'm getting at, right? Is that when you look at the Retro City Rampage website, I was really impressed because it's a really effective, I want to say, like, marketing website, much more effective than virtually every indie developer I've ever seen. And what's interesting to me is that you have displayed a real aptitude for business and for marketing, which I actually think is lacking in a lot of game developer education, right? So how did you get into that mindset of, like, you're a developer? How did you get into this, I'm not even trying to phrase the question, but, like, how did you prepare yourself for, I am, in addition to making this game, I'm also in charge of marketing. I'm also in charge of running the business.
I think part of it is being a perfectionist, and part of it is that everything was on the line. And so when it comes down to it, I generally have a tendency which is kind of a blessing, in that I realize, okay, now it's time to do programming, now it's time to do art, now it's time to do design, now it's time to do marketing. And when I do those, sometimes I will think, there's a quick way I can do this, but by the end of it, I've always gone all in. And so when it came to marketing, I was reading everything I could, talking with as many people as I could. What tips do you have? How should I do this? And just trying to understand as much about marketing as I can, and as much about business as I can. And when it was like design, it's like, okay, well, reading all these things on grade level design and so on. And I think the point is, what I tell people is, it's like, most people are putting everything that they can to make the best game possible. And what I tell them is, I say, you've got to put that same energy, that same passion into your website, into your trailer, into your press release, and just treat your press release as, like, this is going to be like a really great level in my game. Like, this is, it can't just be a second thought.
Yeah, and it's interesting too, because now, there's actually some really interesting resources. There's, like, the press kit, open close bracket thing.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, were there any resources that you were able to rely on for that, or was it literally you just Googling stuff and figuring it out yourself?
A lot of Googling, but then over time I started to just talk to more people. And that was the huge advantage that we have as indies, is that in the bigger companies, a lot of stuff is behind NDAs and people are holding their cards close to their chest. With indies, we don't generally see each other as competition. We're always sharing, like, here's how I did on each platform. Here are some tricks for this, tricks for that. And everyone's really open in general. And so I would say half of what I learned was from reading, and half of what I learned was just talking with people. And that's the big one thing I recommend, is people just don't be shy, talk with people and ask them questions.
So now let's have the rubber really hit the road, because we were talking about something really interesting before we started shooting, which was the incredible challenge of trying to actually conceptualize a follow-up to a major success, right? So, I mean, how do you even begin to approach that problem, right? Of, you know, of the fact that, you know, do you even want to make another game? I mean, this game has been successful enough. Maybe you don't have to.
I definitely do. I'm really, really hungry. The funny thing is that when you spend so long making a game and it takes way longer to finish and release than you had hoped, and once you finally ship, or at least in my case, it feeds something in you that you didn't realize you had, that you're just like, wow, that felt good. That felt good to release a game. And now I want to release more games. And one thing that's it kind of holds you back in a way is that you're looking at game ideas and you're thinking, wow, that game would take 3 years, that game would take 5 years. I don't want to do that game because I want to release another game.
Yeah, as soon as possible.
As soon as possible. And so trying to, granted it's been 2 years now and I haven't released a new game yet, but it's definitely something where when I go into production on the next game, I want it to be a shorter development cycle, and it feels good. But it is a tough thing. Being the perfectionist, I kept updating the game after it was released for over a year. And so that held me back from doing a new game because I just wanted to make this current game even better, and then releasing it on new platforms and so on. So it's... There are the two paths that you can go. You can make a sequel that is the game you made before, but realizing its full potential now because now all the hard work's done. And then there's the other thing of, well, I'm kind of tired of that. I want to do something completely different. And that's the big question and the big choice.
It's interesting that you would use the word hungry, though. Right when you started talking, you said, I'm definitely still hungry.
Yeah.
Right? Because that actually implies that, which is, I'm sure, how many artists feel, right? That you really do need to keep working.
Yeah.
Right? You need to keep doing it. Would you say that's true?
Yeah. I mean, I guess I always raise the bar for myself. And so it's, again, a blessing and a curse because it helps me achieve success, but it's also, I'm never satisfied. And so you'd ask me 10 years ago if I would feel that I would be where I am today. No. Like 10 years ago, my idea of success was working at a game studio as a programmer. And when I achieved that, I was just on top of the world. And then you set this, and there are a lot of things, odds stacked against you, and you don't know if you'll be successful, and you hope you will be, and you do everything you can to be. But the hard part is, making that hit game. And then when you do that, you're like, okay, well, you know what? I know I can do it now. So now I know I can do another one and be even more successful and so on. And so you're just constantly, it's like, to me, I don't feel like, okay, I had a hit game. Now it's like, okay, I've proven that I can do it to myself. Now let's see how much further I can go.